welcome to the presentation on understanding and complying with ADA. My name is Victoria Alexander. I'm Vice President for Curriculum Development here at the Learning House. To give you a little bit of background about me, I have been with the company now for almost 9 years. It'll be 9 years on August 3rd. Really proud of that one. And I have had the privilege of working with all of our partner institutions on helping them create ADA compliant courses, which we'll talk about what that means in this presentation. And then also really working with them to create courses that are what I call web compliant, meaning they're accessible via any browser on any operating system. So at this time, I'm going to allow my colleague to introduce herself, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Good morning. My name is Mimi O'Malley. I'm a professional development administrator here at the Learning House. I work with the training department, and right now I'm working on revising some of our best practice courses, which is BP 101, 102, and 103. I did work with Victoria in her curriculum department for about 2.5 years, working with subject matter experts on developing many of our library courses. My background is as an academic librarian, and I've worked in community college as well as for-profit university libraries. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Victoria, and we're going to get started in our presentation.
Thanks, Mimi. So let me tell you a little bit about what we'll talk about today and how we'll kind of bounce back and forth. I'm going to open us up with defining what we look at ADA for when it comes to courses, specifically Section 508. I'll talk a little bit about what we look for at the institutional level with ADA compliance, especially when it relates to online courses. And then I'll turn it over to Mimi, who's going to walk through some very specific things that instructors can do to ensure their courses are what we would call Section 508 compliant, as well as ADA compliant in a more global sense, okay? And then finally, we'll conclude with some very specific action items that institutions can take to ensure that across the board, their campus is ready to provide compliant services to students with disabilities in an online setting, all right? And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll look at the objectives real quick. The goal of this particular presentation are as follows, I should say the goals. First of all, let's define what ADA is, as well as Section 508. We'll look at how course design is impacted by ADA. We'll review some ways to address the varying disabilities, which again is going to be part of what Mimi covers. We'll identify some standard elements that are important for web accessibility. As I said, this is slightly different than just Section 508. We'll also discuss approaches to ADA compliant courses. And then finally, we'll review the institutional services and departments that are important to support students with disabilities. All right? So let's figure out what is ADA as well as Section 508. By show of hands, how many of you actually already are familiar with ADA and Section 508? Okay, so about a third of the room. I'll tell you how Learning House defines it and the specific things that we sort of look at. So ADA, of course, stands for American with Disabilities Act, and it is a very broad-reaching act that Congress enacted so that students, or I shouldn't say students, individuals with disabilities would be able to access any public-funded organizations, institutions, both in a physical setting as well as online. The very specific part of ADA that relates to online is what we call Section 508, and that is referred to oftentimes as web accessibility, okay? So when we talk about ADA, ADA is very broad-reaching. It includes everything that you do on campus to meet the needs of students with disabilities, not just online. When it relates to online-specific activities, that's where Section 508 comes into play. So Section 508 is really a subsection of ADA as a whole. Section 508 is what we actually look towards when we're doing course reviews, because it's the online environment where we have the control. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk more about some institutional services that will help address ADA as a whole, but we will specifically target in Mimi's presentation things that you can do to meet Section 508 compliance, okay? So Section 508, entirely related to the online environment. ADA's broad-reaching includes both what you do on campus as well as off, okay? So this is how ADA impacts online courses. First of all, ADA requires equitable access. And equitable access doesn't necessarily mean that students are getting the exact same thing. What it really means is that you are providing a reasonable alternative to either content or instructional services to students. So for example, if you are actually giving a lecture presentation in class and a student with disabilities just cannot hear, what's going to happen is you don't necessarily have to say verbatim to that student in text form everything you said in class, but you have to give them a reasonable alternative that in some way summarizes or gets to the same information that you presented in class, okay? So equitable access, I don't want anybody to think that it has to be the exact same, because obviously you're going to modify things to meet the needs of the student with a disability. So equitable access is really just an equivocal alternative, not necessarily the exact same thing you did. Technologies must be Section 508 compliant. So again, as I said, online environment, it's all about whether or not the learning management system, for example, is what we call Section 508 compliant, meaning that individuals with disabilities can use it effectively. But the technology in addition to that, so for example, if you use Adobe Connect, that also has to be 508 compliant. So it's not just the LMS, it's not just Adobe Connect, but it's everything you include inside your online classroom has to be 508 compliant because students are accessing it via the web. Accelerated courses actually require accelerated responses. And what we mean by that is, if you're in an 8-week class, you can't spend 3 weeks trying to figure out if a student with disabilities is in your class, okay? So there's a responsibility on the part of the student to identify themselves and identify them early. But if they're going to identify themselves, how quickly can you respond to their needs? How quickly can you make instructional adjustments to ensure that they have that equitable access? Now let's actually flip to addressing the disabilities. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Mimi. She's going to walk through specific disabilities and how you can make instructional adjustments to meet the needs of students with disabilities in your classroom. Mimi?
Excellent. Thanks, Victoria. As Victoria said, this is a section where we're actually going to break down and look at the 6 disability types that are impacted by Section 508. First one is physical disabilities. And of course, this is going to impact those online students where they have to manipulate text and computer accessibility. Learning disabilities is the second that's going to impact your online students. Not only does this relate to the comprehension of your course materials, but also the timing as well as the organization of many synchronous sessions, such as chat sessions. Even exams can be impacted by learning disabilities as well. Visual disabilities are going to impact graphics, photos, those video components that are built into your course design. Hearing impairments impact not only the audio and video in your courses, but again, the timing and organization of your synchronous sessions, as well as in many cases, any external assignments you may require your online students to perform, such as internships, practicums, externships. Speech impairments are going to impact not only oral communication, but also web conferencing, and even any multimedia that you include in your course design that is going to require audio input. Students which suffer from psychological or emotional disabilities may be impacted by situations which trigger stress or even anxiety. That can be the result of timing issues, be that exams, be that how long your synchronous sessions are. Those are all impacting excessive text as well as time that students are processing information. So let's break down each of these individual disabilities and discuss a little bit more further how you can impact web accessibility as well as some instructional strategies. First off, physical disabilities. Physical or mobile disabilities are going to refer to skeletal, respiratory, neuromuscular, cardiovascular, and even pulmonary system disorders. Moreover, spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, and even muscular dystrophy are all common causes of mobility impairments. Online students with physical disabilities are going to have challenges not only with the physical access of a computer keyboard, but also the manipulation of a keyboard, mouse, or even speech input. Therefore, you may want to consider when you're doing course design implementing a joystick or even trackball or speech input that helps physically impaired students who lack fine motor skills, especially those that when they're trying to manipulate small buttons on a screen. You may also want to consider keyboard adaptations, such as tongue touch, keypads, key guards, or even alternative keyboard software applications. There are some alternative keyboards, and an example of that are IntelliKeys or Unicorn expanded keyboard. These all are additional equipment that many of your office accommodations may be able to give more information on, or may even have license to use or to have students use. There are keyboard acceleration techniques that can also allow students to input predefined shorthand text, and then that text will automatically be converted by the computer into a full-fledged word or phrase. Another helpful remedy is word list or word prediction tools, and that allows students to enter a letter or two, just like in your mobile phone, and a pre-programmed word or phrase will appear that the student can select. Before we get into instructional techniques, I just want to make you aware, I'm going through a rather long list here, and again, if this is probably not on your flash drive since this presentation is added in, I'd be happy to, at the end of the presentation, if you take my business card that Sam has at the door, I also have some back near our videographer. You can shoot me an email, and I'll send you this presentation with this list of these products as well. So you don't have to feel like you have to write them all down. Okay? Carol. To the best of my knowledge, the student would need to document through your university Office of Accommodations. They'd have to have a documented case of being ADA needing in Section 508. From there, your Office of Accommodation will probably have a better idea of what tools such as these they may either have a license for, or that they can recommend maybe a vendor in the area that the students could use. I would start with your institutional Office of Accommodation as to those particular tools. Yes? At this point, I'm just kind of giving an overview of the tools that can be provided. What your institution may provide is something I won't be privy to. And that's why I would suggest contacting your institution just to see if, even if they don't provide it, they may have a preferred vendor that they may work with that's local, who can provide not only the tools themselves, but possibly the technical support that may be necessary. Maybe not on this slide, but in some of the other tools that will be presented, there may be some licenses or, that the student can use, and maybe just use that tool over a certain period of time and then turn that tool back in. Your institution may possibly have a license agreement with a product vendor. I would start with your own institution's Office of Accommodations as far as knowing what exactly tools your institution will extend to the online student, or that online student will need to go and access externally on their own. Does that help you answer your question? This isn't certainly an exhaustive list. This is just recommendations for students who may suffer from these impairments, some ideas to maybe go back to and suggest, not only to the online student, but to confirm with your own Office of Accommodations. Do we have these, are these some possible tools that we can offer to online students as well? Anybody else have questions? I know we were going to devote some time at the very end of the presentation if you have further questions. I know since this presentation is being videotaped, we'd like to make sure that everybody can hear your questions, so that's why we thought right at the microphone at the end we'll devote more time as well. Okay. Instructionally, there are some techniques that you can use
and recommend to your instructors that can benefit physically impaired students. That would be allow some short breaks during synchronous sessions for those of you who offer that in your online courses. Those short breaks really allow a physically impaired student who may have slow response times just to kind of catch up, and also even stretch muscles. If they physically have to get up from the computer and stretch, short breaks are wonderful. Also, consider adding more text-based correspondence, building more discussion forums into your course design. When you're also considering course design, you want to incorporate maybe larger icons, more hypertext links that students can actually click on the link and get right to that particular tool or outside resource if they need to. Those are really useful also for some difficult hand movement challenges. Okay. The next area we want to focus on is going to be learning disabilities. And with learning disabilities, they're often undiagnosed, unfortunately. Many students, and I think probably some of you also realize this from your face-to-face students, online students are the same way. They've kind of adopted their own coping strategies for their learning disabilities. And for example, students with reading disabilities will often exhibit slow reading rate, poor comprehension, and even improper syntax. Writing disabilities can range from poor sentence structure, also grammar, mechanical problems, even poor note-taking. For math learning disabled students, you may find that number reversal or even comprehension and confusion of mathematical symbols or formulas are just a few of the challenges that students with math learning disabilities may encounter. Ideally, you want to somewhat encourage online students to use some more search engine and even library subscription databases that will allow for homonym and even spelling variations for these type of students. Books on tape, talking web browsers such as Web Anywhere, and even screen magnification software. An example of that is Microsoft has its own magnifier, are some assistive technologies that you can recommend to individuals with learning disabilities. Instructionally, there are a few steps that you can use not only in your own course design, but in course delivery. And some of those include keep your course shell free from clutter and keep a consistent course screen layout from page to page. Nothing's more distracting when you have a lot of animation, text that is different colors, font sizes. It can impede the reading rate of online students when they're kind of getting a course overview of your course shell. Also, consider your syllabus as a tool to define organization as well, and student expectations in your course. Include transcripts for any type of recorded lectures or PowerPoints. That helps students kind of tackle not only organizational skills, but also test anxiety. Save your documents in a universally accessible format, such as Acrobat, Adobe Acrobat PDF Reader, all right? Because PDF especially has some great highlighting and note-taking tools as well for such students. You may also want to consider giving your students some extended time on test. And when I mean that, I caution they're documented learning disabled students, extended time on tests. You may also want to incorporate more multiple choice, fill in the blank, rapid or matching test questions, those lower recall and comprehension tests. And reason for that is it kind of gives students a chance to recall information instead of more essay type questions that are going to allow focus students on doing more quick, rapid recall in a shorter time span. So consider also the type of test questions that you build in your quiz and course shell design. All right. Visual. Any of you have any idea how many students in higher education suffer from a visual impairment? Anybody have any idea? Okay. 67% of higher education students actually suffer from a visual impairment that cannot be corrected by eyeglasses or contact lenses. And so vision impaired students are going to experience problems that range from light sensitivity to actual central vision loss. So when you're identifying technology to address visual impairment, you're going to want to also be sure to include and consider video as well as audio. When you're identifying technology, consider refreshable Braille. And refreshable Braille actually displays print screen text line by line. But other assistive technologies may include screen reader software, text-only browser software, and there is browsers that offer graphics and sound loading features, which can be turned off. There are also voice recognition programs that are suggestive for visual impaired students. Creating captions for your graphics and images are one of the best tools that you can do to make your visuals more accessible and enhance course design for visually impaired students. Now, instructionally, some techniques instructors can use for visually impaired students include creating documents or presentations against a high and low contrast background to forefront background. And you can always test to see whether or not your PowerPoints or your documents have that high-low contrast if you just print it out on a black and white printer. That'll give you a good test. Also, avoid using varied font sizes or colored text within your course design. A lot of instructors do that to kind of differentiate between required course material and supplemental course material. Ideally, this is not helpful for visual impaired students, all right? So consistent font and text color and size is recommended. Develop your course design in an outline form. This is really helpful for visually impaired students because they can mentally start to see your topic headings are in a bolder font. Your course materials are going to be in a font size a little bit long, the next font size down and maybe unbolded. Mentally, they start to see there's that organizational pattern just by how you outline your course design. For those of you who use Java applets and Macromedia Flash, consider a little bit of tolerance when you use that. And reason being is make sure the settings for those are accessible for visually impaired students. Sometimes those two particular programs, if their settings are not set for accessibility, can be problematic for visually impaired students. And finally, as we stated earlier, save your documents in a universally accessible format such as PDF. It is much easier for visually impaired students as well. Okay. All right, with our next impairment, hearing, a staggering 73% of students in higher education, and this is both face-to-face as well as online, suffer from hearing impairment, and that can range anything from deafness to just hard of hearing. And students with hearing disabilities often rely on transcripts or captions whenever you're going to have videos, webinars, any type of a teleconference component into your online course. A little bit of background about the difference between captioning. And with closed captioning, visible text is turned on and only seen at the discretion of the student. Open captioning, text is always turned on and presented to the student. And with real-time captioning, it's literally the simultaneous presentation and transmission of captions. So that kind of differentiates between the three captioning products. Another assistive technology that some of you may even be aware of is Skype. And reason being is Skype has a built-in webcam that can be particularly useful for hearing impaired students. And I want to give you a little bit of a scenario about a situation. A high school in Maine actually used Skype, and it was a deaf school in Maine, and a deaf instructor actually transmitted his entire course lecture on Skype using webcam. And he used certainly American Sign Language, but it was all captured on Skype with the webcam. And the beauty of Skype, too, was it was archived. So students who were unable to see the presentation, that instructor could actually post a link and be able to have missing students see the presentation as well. So it's an interesting way of using some outside tools such as Skype for some of our disability online students. A particular challenge, though, and this isn't just for some of these products or tools we're seeing here, assistive devices, is you really want to make sure your students have some time, if they do need the assistive technology, to practice it before the class starts, to work out any of the bugs or kinks before that class starts. And if there are some bugs, they can remedy that before the course starts. So some of these devices may not work with certain ports on their student computer. The student wants to find that out before you actually start the class, ideally. All right, so it's just something to consider when you do have a documented student with a disability and they're going to need assistive technologies. Make sure they have a chance to test those out with their own computers prior to the course launch. All right. A little bit about the telephone relay service. How many of you are familiar with that particular service itself? Okay, a few of you are. For those of you who are not, the process works somewhat like this. Say, for instance, an instructor has an office hours and they want to do an online chat with a hearing impaired student. There will be your instructor, your TRS communicator, and you've got your student. So the instructor will telephone and communicate information to the TRS communication specialist. The communication specialist will actually type in their telewriter, and that particular information is then going to feed over to the student. In turn, the student's going to reply, type in the information to the TRS communication specialist, who in turn is going to pass that information, type it in, and send it off to the instructor. So you can see there is a little bit of a communication timing as well, but that's somewhat how the process works with a telephone relay service. All right. I think with the telephone relay service, that is geared, and I need to confirm this also with your Office of Accommodation, for severe deaf students. I think that is one of the assistive devices that can be used. It is an option. If your chat for some reason, if the LMS possibly may have a server be down for a while, it's highly unlikely, this may be another option as well. I would say probably the telephone relay service would be more applicable also to face-to-face. For some of you who may run blended classes, hybrid courses, and you do have a face-to-face component, a telephone relay service may be something to also consider for a student who may be hearing impaired.
And Mimi, if I can jump in for just
Sure.
a second, it also works in the reverse. So if a student needs to call the instructor during their published office hours and they would rather use the TRS service, that's probably more likely of how you would intend for it to be used. Instead of scheduling an office hour to do a chat, the student may just want to pick up the phone, or in this case use their typewriter, but call the instructor immediately to work out a question. So that's one of the ways that it can be used in lieu of chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria. Excellent. Anybody? Okay. Instructionally, there are some great things instructors can do to consider addressing hearing impaired students. Biggest one, any multimedia that you're going to include in your course design, make sure it's got some kind of captions and preferably transcripts for those students. During a synchronous session, consider timing and even the pace of verbal exchanges. And this is especially important if you do have a telephone relay service. You know, that voice over, give some time, allow for longer verbal exchanges. If you are going to have a student that will need an interpreter, American Sign Language interpreter, that needs to be present prior to scheduling a synchronous session, be sure you kind of make sure that interpreter is aware of the time you're going to have that session prior to the session starting. That also goes along the lines of if you're going to have your student do any outside assignments, internships, practicums, externships, and they will need to have an American Sign Language interpreter. Make sure all of that is arranged prior to that student needing to have that time to fulfill that assignment. Again, if you're going to use Skype or even an outside social chat tool, be sure you have the ability to archive that session. Very important if that particular hearing impaired online student is not available for that session and needs to have access to the same course materials that were covered in that session. Okay. All right, speech impairments. A student with speech impairment will have challenges with certainly oral communication, and that's going to be in presentations you may require your online students to conduct, phone calls, video conferencing, any kind of live discussions that you may have in a synchronous session, and any kind of software you're going to require in your course design that requires audio input. Voice recognition systems such as OpenVXI, FestFox, Project, SMU, these are all useful for students who are unable to produce sounds consistently. But these may not necessarily be tools to use for students who have speech disabilities that result in just a lack of clarity. All right? Some of these are a little more rigorous than others. Students who are able to use voice recognition systems, once again, should take time before they're actually going to need to use these products to test them, as well as train the selected system to recognize their own voice, all right, before you actually have the course launch. Microsoft Office has a great tool right on their product portfolio, and that's a voice command and diction feature. You also have some great screen reader assistive technologies such as Windows, non-visual desktop access that will interpret what's being displayed on the screen. There are also some web-based chat software such as Ajax that you may also want to consider, and they also give a real-time chat transcription as well. Individuals with speech disabilities may use assistive devices, but again, consider and just keep in the back of the mind, some of the software may not necessarily be compatible with your online student's computer device. And once again, can't reiterate enough the ability to have those students make sure that those devices are compatible, give them time to test it, and in the case of speech, they get to train that system to recognize their voice as well. Instructionally, you can certainly help speech impaired students by adding more text-based interactions, discussion forums, chat rooms, synchronous sessions with chat and text input. Instant messaging tools are all instructional tools you can incorporate more into your course design. And if you are going to include oral presentations as one of your, or more than one of your assignments in your online class, consider allowing your speech impaired students a little more time in their presentation. And for some of those students, you may want to give them the option of just giving more one-on-one presentation, where the student gives a presentation to the instructor alone if they're not comfortable giving it to the entire class. Something to consider as well. All right, accounting for the largest share of disabled students in higher education, a whopping 76% of students suffer from either a psychological or an emotional disability. And this figure really is staggering, considering that more than 2 million Americans suffer from epilepsy, and more than 125,000 new cases of epilepsy are reported each year in this country. So as you can see, this is a rising problem that doesn't seem to be subsiding anytime too soon. Psychological and emotional disabilities are going to include depression, anxiety, stress disorders. Even medically treated students may experience impaired eye-hand coordination, blurred vision, possibly vertigo, sleeplessness, disorientation. So inconsistent course shell design, properly or improperly designed course syllabus, rigid time tests, these can all challenge students who suffer from psychological or emotional disabilities. Now, there are some technology assistive techniques, devices to consider for these students. And what you may want to consider when you are having course design elements that include flickers, you'll want to change the frequency of less than twice a second or 2 megahertz, HZs, or you're going to want to change that frequency to greater than 55 times a second. All right. Your Office of Accommodation will also be much more well versed on those settings if you have problems or you don't remember that as well. For students who suffer from photosensitive epilepsy, you may want to suggest to those students to either purchase flicker-free monitors or even glare guard for their monitors. Now, you may also want to instructionally consider avoiding or incorporating, more text alternatives for these students. And reason being is when you upload study guides or test outlines to help them for test prep, these really give students a little more comfort level and reduce some of the test anxiety that some students may have, and that's both face-to-face as well as online. You also want to avoid and reduce any animation, again, blinking text, offensive color patterns, yellows, oranges, really difficult to see for especially vision impaired, but it can also impact the psychological and emotional learning disabled students as well. When we're talking specifically about assessments and quizzes and exams, if you do have a documented psychological or emotional student, you may want to allow a little more extended time for those students to take a test. Again, consider incorporating more lower recall test questions, your multiple choice, fill in the blank, matching. All right. Those are all some techniques instructionally that can be done to address students with these impairments. If you're going to offer synchronous sessions in your courses, consider allowing breaks in between a long synchronous session. In an hour-long session, you may want to give a 5 to 10-minute break. We talked about that for physical students. They can get up, stretch their muscles, hand coordination on the mouse. It's also useful for psychological and emotional students. Okay. As you can see, making your course accessible is not something you really want to wait on doing right before you're doing a course launch. It's something to consider when you are in the course design phase, all elements when you're uploading and considering your course materials. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Your own institution's Office of Accommodation certainly is well versed on tools, techniques, outside vendors, local vendors in your area that can assist online students with any of these particular documented disabilities. If you have further questions though, again, my card is in the back. I'd be happy to extend this list to you if you do want to bring these to your Office of Accommodation and see if they may have these tools for online students. Okay. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Victoria, where she's going to kind of wrap up items with regards to your institution as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you, Mimi. I know that was a lot of information to take in, and I think one of the things that highlights for me is that when it comes to designing courses and delivering courses online, thinking about the online student as a part of the development process is really important, because to make accommodations as the course is being taught, especially if it's accelerated, is incredibly difficult. And I have so many examples where we're having to do that with instructors now, and it does become more of a labor issue on the instructor that's teaching it, as well as on the student who has to wait for those accommodations to be made. So really important to consider as a part of the course development. So let's just look at compliance, okay? I'm going to try to summarize very quickly so we can get to some questions if you have any, what we would recommend that you do. So first and foremost, we believe that there's 4 keys to creating ADA compliant courses. The first is to set standards. At the institutional level, when you decide to go online with an entire program, to make sure that that program is accessible from start to finish for students, we actually recommend that you set standards. A part of that will include setting standards around what instructors are required to put into their courses, maybe even on the syllabi, but also in terms of the type of content that you want to see at a bare minimum across the courses. Create templates. This is a really easy way to facilitate proper course development for the instructor. If they have templates that outline very clearly what you're expecting for them to include as a baseline for the courses to meet ADA compliance, then it makes it easy for them to complete it, and they're not having to think about course development in terms of ADA compliance. They're creating the course ADA compliant from the beginning because you're giving them the templates they need. And then enforce standards, which is, I hate to say it, one of the mechanisms you've got to use to make sure that you are meeting ADA compliance. So it's great to set standards, great to create templates, but if nobody's accountable for it, how do you really know it's getting done? So one of the things you got to do is enforce the standards that you set. And then finally, I really recommend this. I know some people look at me and like, but that means my class is boring. Classes don't have to be boring just because you keep it simple, okay? And we'll talk about what keeping it simple means. So I will talk about support services before I get to keeping it simple, because I think keeping it simple will be at the end with a couple of just key things to keep in mind. But support services, library resources can always be used to make sure that your courses are ADA compliant, especially when they are considering purchasing new equipment. Have them think about students with disabilities in the online environment, such as, let's say that there's a video that you love or that you really want your institution to acquire. Make sure that video comes with closed captioning already included. If you're going to do lecture capture in your classrooms, or if you're going to record your lectures, make sure that there's an option with the equipment or the software that you're using whereby you can easily include the notes, or you can very easily get closed captioning embedded. So when you're talking with your library about what they're going to be purchasing so that you can teach effectively both on ground and online, make sure you're thinking about those students with disabilities. Additionally, ask your librarian to select accessible versions of things that already exist. So let's say you have videos you already use, but there's not a closed captioning element. I can't believe that they would have already purchased that, but maybe there's some older videos that are not closed captioned. Ask them to go and purchase a separate piece that is closed captioned for that video. Don't allow it, I would say don't use materials that you know right now are not accessible, but instead make this a case to go to your library and say, we really have to make this accessible, or go hire somebody to transcribe the video. And I think the accessible version is probably cheaper. So I would definitely say go to your librarian and sort of force that issue, because it's important to meet all students with disabilities needs, both in on-ground and online. And then make sure that when you go online, if there are students who are going to need extra time, or who would really prefer to be in an environment, not at home, to take a test, which we often talked about test proctoring as an environment for those to ensure they're not cheating, but it's also a safe haven for people who have disabilities who want immediate tech support from a live person physically there with them. Tested proctoring centers are a great opportunity for that. So if you are going to go online, I would encourage your institution to have some test proctoring centers set up. Most students, as we know in online, come within a 50-mile radius of the institution. So for the most part, it's not difficult to set up test proctoring centers. You may already have them, but the online students don't know about them. So make that option available to your students. There's some references that Mimi has compiled in relation to this, and the references are, you can go to verify that what we said is accurate if you'd like. They will be included, of course, with the PowerPoint. But as I said before, keep it simple. I want to just give you a couple of things, okay? Mimi talked a lot about the ability to include more text in courses, and most people think text is boring. But really, text is a very easy way to make sure that your courses are compliant. Text also provides students an opportunity to learn independently. If they have to watch a live session, it forces them to sit down and try to gather as much information in that session as they can, especially if it's not archived. If it's archived, that's a little bit of a different case, but the other challenge to it being archived is that there's not a text equivalent of what you said as the instructor in the online classroom. For a student with a disability, you're required to provide that text equivocal. So maybe it's a summary of what you said per slide, or maybe it's just a summary of the overall presentation, but you have to have a text version available for that student. So by creating more text documentation up front and using your lecture opportunities as abilities to sort of clarify points, you're reducing the stress that you have around creating text equivocal content for the student with a disability, okay? So I realize text can seem boring, but it doesn't have to be. It can be presented very well, but it makes sure that up front your course is ADA compliant. Now, I also don't subscribe to no multimedia, but as Mimi pointed out, flash animations, the things that people think make their courses so engaging and great, are also very difficult to provide web accessibility to. There are some inherent tools that you can use, but if you're creating it on your own, odds are you're not using the appropriate web accessibility tools necessary to make it compliant for ADA students. So if you are going to do a lot of multimedia, you need to plan up front additional time, again, to create equivocal alternatives to that content for students with disabilities. Because like I said, when you're trying to deliver the course, to go back and try to create that alternative, that equal alternative, very, very time consuming. So if you're going to do multimedia in your class, be prepared to take on the investment of creating that equal alternative for a student with a disability, okay? So keeping it simple, make sure you start off with text, then go to multimedia, and that way you always have a text base from which to work and provide to the students as a summary. And the other part is, if you're going to do a lot of interactivity, make sure that you're planning to ensure it is accessible with all kind of web browsers and across platforms, and that can take additional time. So budget that into your course development process. That is the conclusion of this presentation. At this time, we'll take any Q&A that you might have.
And
what questions?
If you do, I'd recommend if you can go to the microphone just so it's recorded, everybody can hear you, that would be excellent.
In a university setting, it's important to encourage critical thinking skills in writing, etc. In our exams that we would be offering accommodations such as you suggested, multiple choice, true, false, that sort of thing, how do you score those in order to weight it differently than their writing so that you can get a equitable experience for those that don't need the accommodation as to those that do? How do you deal with all that?
I'll take a stab at it first. So there's a couple of things. As Mimi was pointing out, having those lower recall questions available are very important so students get comfortable with the material, but that's not in lieu of the normal test that you would give. So if you normally would require writing for a particular assessment, include that. But what you may want to do is, instead of having it be a timed writing sample for a student with a disability where they only have maybe an hour and a half to complete the essay, make it a take-home essay for the student with a disability, and they can upload it as a single file document the same way they would some of their other writing assignments. The lower recall questions can be used across the board for your students as maybe practice questions in preparation for an exam, so that you're giving everybody the opportunity to get more confidence, but it's really important for the student that has a disability. So instead of making instructional accommodations that might, I don't want to say jeopardize the integrity of what you're trying to accomplish at that instructional level, it's more about providing additional opportunities for success. And that's where the students with disabilities really gain confidence, in having additional opportunities to test their memory, test their knowledge, and maybe giving them a little bit more time on certain assignments so that they can demonstrate their best instead of being feeling anxious about the time limits.
Also, and to dovetail what Victoria said, consider your LMS's features and tools. Those tests can also be, settings can be changed for one of your students in your class if need be. Your Learning House client support specialist will help you guide through how to set up a test where you may have a documented disabled student who may need some time extension. And they can help you work through those and set those settings as well. So that's another thing, is use your LMS to its full capacity as well.
Any additional questions?
Go right ahead, Carol.
Is closed captioning available through a live Adobe Connect feature through Learning House? And if we produce audio, PowerPoints, etc., does Learning House have the people to put the closed captioning in for us, or do we need to do both of those?
Gotcha. So closed captioning is actually a part of the production piece of a video, and Adobe Connect, because it's geared towards synchronous sessions that can be recorded, closed captioning is not a part of that unless you have a transcriber that's going to be typing into the chat session, essentially providing the captioning in real time, but it would end up being closed captioning when you get to the point of it being viewed by the students in the archive, okay? So closed captioning is typically only associated with videos. For example, YouTube has a beta translation service, or transcription service, should I say, for closed captioning. I'm gonna tell you right off, it works very funky at times, so you gotta test it and make sure that you're speaking clearly so that it captions it right. But that would be an example of, if you upload your video to YouTube and test it out to make sure that the closed captioning service they provide automatically is working properly, it's an easy way to ensure that you have ADA compliant videos. As far as Learning House providing those services, if you provide a PowerPoint with notes embedded, it by default will be ADA compliant when we convert it to the Adobe Presenter, which is that piece that shows it sort of in a flash-based format on screen, and it auto goes as the voice goes, or if you just have it on set for a click-through, they would be able to see the notes. The notes that you embed with your PowerPoint are considered a part of the option for ADA students. They can see them, and that's those equivocal access that I was talking about earlier, or excuse me, equitable access. That's where you're not maybe saying exactly what you said via audio, but you're giving a summary of it for the PowerPoint slide, and therefore you're providing, you're meeting the needs of that student with disabilities. So, yes.
Obviously, providing a transcript of something takes some time. But we also have technology that is speech to text.
Yes.
What, if anything, are your experiences of using speech to text as you're talking through, for example, the way I would present or prepare an advance in flipping a course content piece would be to simply do it Adobe Connect with no audience,
So
archive it and slot it in, but at the same time, I could potentially be using a speech-to-text software bar.
Agreed. So the challenge is going to be the speech-to-text normally works only in one program at a time. So it's not as if you can go into Adobe Connect, record, and your computer also be doing speech-to-text at the same time. So normally it just works one or the other. Sorry. But an option is to do speech-to-text, to go ahead and prepare what you would normally say using your word processor, using that speech-to-text tool, and then copy and paste that into the actual PowerPoint presentation maybe you want to do in Adobe Connect, or make that transcript separately available for students. So just to give you an example, with one of our institutions, part of what we do with them for every single lecture that they provide is they record the lecture in PowerPoint with audio. They provide us a script summary of what they did, and we load that into the course as the transcript in a web accessible format like PDF so students can download, and then we convert their PowerPoint with audio to an MP3 and an MP4. So you want to talk about making it accessible across the board, every option you can imagine on mobile devices and otherwise, they have that. And so that's an easy way to make sure that across the board you're getting that web accessibility and meeting students' needs. Any other questions? I tell you what, as Mimi said, she has cards in the back. We really appreciate you joining us for this presentation, and we hope that you learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam has cards, and I did put some cards right behind our videographer. I'm sorry, it's not the best place for some of you over in the other room, but Sam will help you out. Thank you.